All right, everyone, welcome into the next lecture here. This is around license management in Azure AD in Office 365 too. This is a very important piece here and actually breaks up a couple different conversations, which we'll be discussing here as we go through. So let's go ahead and dive right in. So license management inside of the cloud. Well, why do we care? Well, you have to remember, you're paying for it. Licenses are assigned at an individual or a group level. So what we're going to be focusing on here, we've already seen the individual. We've assigned licenses to people. That's obviously very difficult, and it's very, we'll call annoying, really, when it comes down to it. It's very inefficient as well. Because really, when we're looking at it, we have to be able to manage that. Imagine that on a scalable level, like if we wanted to do thousands of people at a time, forget about it. Never going to happen. So what we're going to do here is we're going to start looking at group-based licensing here. So we can essentially create a group, and when we add a user to that group, they'll automatically inherit the license. Couple caveats here to this one here. We require the Azure AD Premium Plan 1 license for this to happen. So that means we have to have the EMS E3 or EMS E5. We have to have just a standalone Azure AD Premium Plan 1 license or the Premium Plan 2 license. Or we have to have a Microsoft 365 E3 or E5. Any of those will include this Premium Plan 1 license. This service here, the solution, is incredibly scalable. As I said, when we're dealing with users and such at scale, very large quantities of them, scripting could be done, yes, but again, why when we can make things much easier, to be honest with you. Most important part of this here is cost effective. And you say, well, why? Well, remember, you're paying for these licenses here, so this really begs a question now of the user onboarding and offboarding experience. What I mean by that is when a user essentially joins the organization and when the user leaves the organization. This is a very common scenario here. We can't just keep paying for these users here. We have to have some sort of governance around essentially onboarding and offboarding them. We pay per month for every user that is licensed. So when an user leaves the organization, there may be compliance requirements to keep the data. That is a very common scenario, depending on their position, depending on the vertical that they're in. Maybe they're in a healthcare vertical, maybe they're in a government vertical, and they got to keep data for years. Well, do we continue paying for that? Well, we got to look at it here. So let's look at a couple examples here. So an onboarding example, this one's a little bit easier. So again, we are hiring Sally. Sally is hired in HR. She's an HR person, and we have hired her in. So generally speaking, we would create a on-premise AD account. And in this instance here, using the group-based licensing here, we have a Microsoft 365 E5 security group. We add her to that on-premise security group. The account and that group membership is synchronized via the AD Connect server. And guess what? Sally can log in and do all of the stuff she needs to do. So onboarding is pretty easy. Now, again, we may want to potentially look at automation. I have a lot of customers who go towards automation. So again, looking at this here is that Sally is created in our HR system. Okay, so this is where we handle payroll and merit raise, all of those things that are handled from the HR systems. Well, a lot of those will be able to integrate inside of Active Directory. So when Sally is hired, we can automatically have an Active Directory account created with the information that's inside of the HR system. We can automatically have her added to this security group. And then the AD Connect already runs in the background every 30 minutes. So the next time that happens, boom, Sally will be up in Office 365. She'll have her account provisioned and everything. She'll be ready to go. So again, sky's the limit when it comes down to this. Onboarding is really not that complicated. However, it's just understanding that there's little nuances to the way that we have to do things now. But again, at the end of the day, an AD account is created. We add them to this security group for the licensing, and then she has access to everything after that. Now, let's look at a little bit more complicated of a scenario where we have offboarding. Okay, so here's the example. Sally leaves the organization under any circumstance. We're not going to get down to that point. We'll get to the point where we start talking about insider risk management and, all of those rogue administrators and those types of concepts. We'll get to those in time, but not here. So Sally leaves the organization. Let's just say she puts her 2 weeks notice in and she is done. Okay. But because of the, we'll say, compliance factors here, the organization's got to keep her data around for 10 years because, remember, she's in HR, so it's got sensitive information inside of it. All right. And we have to keep that around for 10 years. Well, what options do we have? Well, in this instance here, there are no right or wrong answers. Okay. There's good, not so good, and then, yeah, there are bad answers. But there are no 100% right answers when it comes down to it. But I'll show you here as we walk through it, what are some of these options that we have to do? Well, option one, we can delete Sally's account in the on-premise Active Directory. Okay, so on-premise Active Directory, we delete her account. Well, what happens there? So the next time that the Active Directory Connect server runs, we'll see in that 30-minute cycle there, it will say, all right, Sally's account is no longer around, and we are going to delete it. So it moves her account to the deleted user section in Azure Active Directory, sticks around for 30 days, and then deleted permanently. Gone. Completely out of the system, forever gone. That user account is no longer recoverable after 30 days. All right, her exchange data, so her email data, it will persist for 14 days. Now this is by default. We can extend this out to 30, but it'll persist for 14 days and then also permanently deleted. Then we have her OneDrive data. So any kind of files or anything that she has in her OneDrive data will persist for 93 days and then permanently deleted. Again, this is by default. We can change this. There's actually a lot of other pieces around this. When we get to the OneDrive piece, we'll walk through that. Exchange also, we'll look at that a little bit more too. But this option right here, does this make sense for the scenario that we gave? Well, no, because all of her data is going to go away at most, or at the longest, 93 days, her OneDrive data is gone, but her user account's going to be gone, her email will be gone after 14 days, and then all of her data is going to be gone. This does not hit our compliance requirements. So this is not a viable reason. We cannot just start deleting accounts. All right, well, let's take the flip here. Let's take option number 2. So option 2 is we disable Sally's account, okay, but we keep the license attached to it. So we just disable it, and at that point here, the user, Sally, will be unable to log in to Office 365. You are unable to log in if your account is disabled inside of Active Directory. So the user won't be able to log in. That's fine. So that's, again, that's secure. We're closing the doors on it. Same concept. If I were to delete her user, I would not be able to log in either. Keep that in mind. All of my data sources will persist for as long as I have that license on them. The biggest caveat here is that you still have to pay for that license. And remember, we have 10 years on this. So what is that, 120 months? 120 months times, let's just say she had, according to that, she had an E5 license. That was 50, let's just round it to $55 per month. You can do the math on that. For that one user, we're paying a ton of data. Ton of money. All of that data is still sticking around. For what purpose? This is kind of the opposite of option 1 here. Is where option 1 is we completely purge your stuff quickly. Option 2 is we keep the stuff forever, but we have to pay for it. Neither one of these are reasonable solutions for our scenario that we have. I'm going to propose to you here option 3, which is probably the best option available, but it requires knowledge of things that we have not talked about yet. So as we continue having this discussion here, is we can create a disabled users OU that is not synchronized inside of the Azure Active Directory Connect server. Okay, we'll do that, and we're actually going to set that up here in Lab in just a minute. We're going to move Sally's on-premise AD account to that OU, okay? So the next time the AD Connect server runs, it's going to say, all right, my user is deleted because I am not in a synced OU. Okay, this OU is essentially shielded from it. It treats it as a deleted user in Azure Active Directory. So in that instance there, AD Connect will treat the user as deleted. And again, still follow that 30 days process, 14 days for email, and then 93 days for OneDrive. However, we have something else. This is where we get the concept of service-side retention. Now, we can also do litigation holds or any type of hold. We'll just say hold on the data. This is a compliance factor, and this is a factor we have not talked about yet, but this is a very common scenario. So when we're looking at service-side retention, we're actually looking at holding on to the data after the user's gone solely for discovery purposes, e-discovery in particular. This is around legal entities and all of that. We will get to that in time. But again, right now I wanted to pose this option here for you. This is the best of both worlds. We get to get the user out of Azure Active Directory because, again, I don't like keeping user accounts around. They can get stale. They could be a security risk. Not a good idea. I like moving them out of there. So what ends up happening here is that they start getting the deprovision process inside of Azure Active Directory and they go away. Cool. Server-side retention will hold the data for discovery purposes, but it will not be viewable for anybody else. Those all exist in subsections. And again, we'll go more into that later on. However, looking at this as a whole here, this is the easiest and the best way. It checks all of the boxes that we need here. The reason why I like to create a disabled users OU is for, well, one of a couple reasons here. So here's some important questions that we have to ask. What happens if Sally rescinds her separation? This happens a lot. She says, she leaves for a day or two and she's like, well, this just wasn't for me. Okay, well, remember, we still have that timer essentially of 14 days. We can go up to 30 for the email, 93 for OneDrive. The user accounts for 30 days. So let's just say we move our exchange up to 30 days. Great. At that point there, Sally says, okay, I didn't want to. This wasn't for me. I would like to come back. And they work through all that. Great. Comes back. Everything is great. All I have to do when I use a disabled users OU is take that user account from that disabled users OU, move her back to a production users OU. And what ends up happening is that AD Connect server will run and it'll say, oh, this user was deleted. They're no longer deleted. They are, we'll call them restored at that point there, as well as all of the data that was in there is also attached back to her account. Takes all of 5 seconds. Good to go. The account's back to exactly the was right before she left. So we can do that. That's very easy to work through. What happens if Sally tries to go rogue? So again, this is another concept, just a question. The answers we're going to come to in time. But what happens if Sally tries to go rogue? She tries to steal a bunch of data. She tries to exfiltrate a whole bunch of stuff. And she, does some bad stuff, we'll just say. So what happens if she does? Well, again, we have tools for that. Again, that's around the idea of insider risk management. We'll get to that in time. That's around compliance factors. That is another option that we have, but it's a question that we have to really understand. What do we do with her devices? She has let's just say she has her email on her personal device. Okay, her personal phone, let's just say. Or she has a personal computer where she has been using and doing work from, and she has local documents saved on there. What do we do with all of that stuff? Well, we can't just take it. Obviously, it's hers. What do we do with it? Well, this is around the idea of Intune management here around containerization. A lot of different things we can do there too. Do we want to allow our manager to access her data before it's permanently deleted? So again, we know the instance of keeping it around for e-discovery. Yes, we talked very briefly on that. We brushed on that. That's fine. But what if there's the data in there and we want to have access to it and get everything we can out of it to be able to, move that data wherever it needs to go, and then it can go about its deletion process. We have that as an option as well. We'll get to that when we start talking about OneDrive. But OneDrive has a whole host and a whole suite of tools that are available to us to be able to automate a lot of these things too. These are all questions that really we have to have answers to because these are modern types of questions here. This happens a lot. What happens in these types of scenarios? These are just questions. And I'm sure there's probably 100 other questions that we can ask too, but these are ones that are most common, the ones that I hear and I get from my customers is that, hey, what do we do with the data, and all of this? We want to make sure that we're not paying more than we need to, but we also want to make sure we keep the data around for periods of time that is needed for legal compliance. Again, all of that is a big factor here. We'll talk about it in time, but when we're looking at licensing and user deprovisioning, well, that's where we have to really come into play here is we have to make sure that we are first and foremost keeping track of the way that our licenses are attached inside of Office 365. So with that being said, that's the last bit. I hope I asked at least got you thinking here around when users come into the company and when they leave a company, things change. So I hope I've kind of at least got you thinking about that as it stands, because there's probably more questions that you can think of off the top of your head. So again, we'll talk about more things as it goes through here, but I'm just going to kind of plant some of these seeds as we come into it. Again, around compliance, that's we have an entire section around compliance and governance. That's a whole big factor nowadays. Great. We'll talk about all of these factors here too. So with that being said, that is going to be it for this particular lecture here. We're going to jump right into lab. We're going to set up some group-based licensing and show you essentially how to create a disabled users OU and what that process looks like. So again, we will jump into there. Hope you learned something on this one here. Thank you for your time, and hope to see you in the next one.